All right. So hello and good evening. I'm starting our time together with my land acknowledgement. As a settler on Turtle Island, right now in the space I'm on is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwa and Chippewa Nation, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois, which include the Oneida Nation, the Lenape, also known as Delaware, and the Ottawadoran, also known as the Neutral, and the Wendat, also known as the Huron people. In this space, I acknowledge that the privilege I have of being the executive director for Equality Coalition of Ontario. And that means I have a great amount, along with a great amount of responsibility. I participate actively in this acknowledgement of the land around me and the rest of the work for the rest of this day and this week. Today is important for me to center the land as a means to ground myself to the content of my work and our gathering here tonight. When I feel connected and centered, I feel more open and more prepared to listen wholeheartedly. Today, when we think of finance, I can't help but reflect on the financial greed that led to the colonization of this land. The agreement in which the land we stand on is Treaty 6, established in 1596. Reminding myself of this history helps me contextualize what it means to be a Londoner. It gives me pause to think about the impacts of colonization at a community that was in the space long before the city limits were established. This is especially helpful to us as we work to return to a community that values gender equality. At which, thank you and welcome. So normally we have Linda Davis talk a little bit about the Gender Equality Coalition, and she's not with us tonight. So briefly, the Gender Equality Coalition is a group of folks that are working towards gender justice. And so tonight's conversation is gender and the economy. And I'm really pleased to welcome our speakers. We have Jim Stanford, and Jim is an economist and director of the Center for Future Work. He divides his time between Vancouver and Sydney, Australia. Jim is one of Canada's best known economists. He served for over 20 years as the economist and director of policy with Unifor Canada's, which is Canada's largest private sector trade union. He's quoted frequently in the print and on broadcast media to contribute regularly to commentaries to the Toronto Star, Global National News, CKNW Radio. And he is also the Herald's industry professor in economics at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, and an honorary professor in the Department of Political Economy of the University of Sydney. Next, we have Dr. Eva Jewell. She is a Anishinaabe from Descan-Zibring, Chippewa of the Thames First Nation in southwestern Ontario, with paternal Haudenosaunee lineages from Oneida Nation of the Thames. Her scholarship supports community-led inquiry on topics of language, governance, and cultural resurgence amongst Anishinaabe people, as well as the urban Indigenous perspectives on gender, work, and care. Dr. Jewell is the research director at the Yellowhead Institute of First Nation-led policy think tanks, and is the assistant professor in sociology department at a university that I can't read on my page. Sorry, Jewell. Our last speaker is Claudia Dessanti, and she is the Senior Manager of Policy of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, where she leads a broad range of policy initiatives to support Ontario's business community. Claudia founded and co-chairs the OCCS Energy Policy Council, overseeing the Ontario Economic Report, and leads work around the environment and energy and regional economic development data policy, housing diversity and inclusion, and more. So welcome all three of you. I'm just going to highlight you so we can see you. There we go. So welcome, and we'll start first with Eva and our first question of the night, and that is, what does gender justice mean to you?
That's a good question. Hi, everyone. I guess, let me say, I am really happy to be here this evening. I'm join with you all today from Toronto, which is also a continuation of my where my ancestors and it's my traditional territory. But I'm originally from the London area, Chippewas Reservation Station, as Danny has mentioned. And so I'm going to speak tonight in all of my kind of in all the prompts that are going to be asked tonight is from an Anishinaabe perspective, because that's where I grew up. I grew up in Chippewas Reservation Station, Deshkanzibing, which is also the traditional name of the London area. And so I guess I have my short answer is that gender justice is to live in a world that doesn't discriminate based on gender identity or expression, and where there is liberation and equity for all genders and expressions. And so, as I said, I'm Anishinaabe. I look at issues like this with a lens that Canada is a settler colonial state. And so when I think about gender justice, I think it's very much intertwined with justice for Indigenous peoples, and with a critical view of Canadian culture more broadly, which is, of course, rooted in Euro-Western norms because it's a settler colonial state. And so this language we speak, the institutions we uphold, and of course, the social norms that we inhabit, they weren't always here, right? So when I'm looking at gender justice, I'm really looking at it with a mind of what does it look like for us to think about gender in terms of what is, here, what is the law of this land? We live in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty territory, and that is a treaty and an agreement with human beings with, of course, real gender roles and equity amongst those roles in the worldview of the Anishinaabe people, and as well as the Onkwoyomwe people or the Haudenosaunee people. So that's a little bit about what I think gender justice is. Again, I think it's really intertwined with questions of decolonization and Indigenous sovereignty.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll go to you, Claudia.
Thank you. I love that perspective and agree with everything you said, Eva. I'll just add a couple things, which first of all, I see gender justice not so much as a destination or something that's achieved, but also something that is an ongoing process, because how we define gender justice is constantly evolving and the issues that are up for debate are evolving. So ideally, we should be continually asking ourselves, how can we make things more equitable? But ultimately, we are looking for a place in which social, economic, and political opportunities are not limited by one's gender. And I think it's also really important when we talk about gender justice to talk about intersectionality, which is the idea that multiple identities can coexist within a person and that will shape their experiences. And Eva discussed this a little bit as well. I am a white woman and my experiences will be very different from a woman that is transgendered, or a woman with disabilities, or an Indigenous woman, or a woman with multiple intersecting identities. And that matters a lot because we can't adopt a one-size-fits-all solution. We really need to think about how one's identity is shaped by multiple different factors. So intersectionality is important. And the last thing I'd mention too is that every domain of gender justice is interconnected. So we can't talk about social gender justice without talking about economic justice or political justice. And whenever a single set of rights is undermined, it will affect all the others. So I think to give a very practical example, we can look at what's happening in the US with abortion. And this is not a chamber position on abortion. There's no view from the chamber on that issue. But I will say that when women's rights are limited in any capacity, it does affect their ability to engage in the economy and in society more broadly. And that's true for any group, any gender. So however you define someone's identity, you need to think about the interplay between all of those.
Thank you. I was just had a conversation the other day how, that the issue around abortion is a bit of attack on, the financial well-being of women. So I appreciate that thought. Jim, welcome. What does gender justice mean to you?
Thank you very much, Danny, and thank you very much to the Gender Equality Coalition for the opportunity to participate in the panel. It's a great honor for me as a male economist to also be able to join with you in this common cause for gender equality. What does gender justice mean for me? I thought both Eva and Claudia's remarks were bang on, and I amplify those and echo them. Put simply, people of all genders, including obviously women and men, trans people, non-binary, gender diverse communities, all have to have an opportunity to pursue their lives to the fullest with full support and recognition and respect and fair treatment at every step of the way, from birth to early childhood education to schooling to work to retirement to life in community. And I want a world in which your gender does not matter in terms of your life chances, that you can pursue every opportunity that's before you. And look for not just opportunity, but equal and just outcomes and fair treatment all along the way, including, as an economist, I'm concerned with how we share the wealth and the prosperity that we produce through our collective efforts in the economy. And that includes sharing it fairly across all genders. And of course, gender intersects with other dimensions of inequality and oppression in our society, including the ones that have been mentioned: race, indigeneity, colonization, immigration status, but others as well. Class, I'm always concerned with how class shapes inequality across all of those other areas, including gender. And the intersection of your class position with your gender situation is obviously an extra factor in understanding how you're treated and what to do about it. I'm an economist, so I'm interested in the economy, and I'm a labor economist, so I'm particularly interested in the world of work, and I have a special interest in gender justice in the world of work, whereby people, regardless of their gender, again, have got access to good, safe, decent, gratifying, well-compensated jobs, because that is how the majority of us have to support ourselves. I mentioned class earlier. And by my definition, the working class consists of everyone who has to work for a living over their life cycle. And that's, by my reckoning, about 85% of the population have to work in an employment relationship for someone else in order to support themselves. And the nature of that employment relationship shapes all kinds of things in our life, including how gender is impacted. So I'd like to see a world of work that is not segmented, first of all, where women are not pushed into certain occupations that just by coincidence happen to be badly paid compared to the rest of them, but where women and people of all genders have got access to the full spectrum of opportunities in the labor market, where they get good training opportunities, where they're paid fairly, where they're safe at work. And in the gender world, that also means safe from gendered harassment and violence, and also support at work for the gender harassment and violence that women face outside of work. So employment policies need to consider, for example, paid leave for victims of domestic or family violence to support them in grappling with it and escaping from it. That's a workplace issue with an obvious gender dimension. Opportunities for promotion, opportunities for representation. Women, my background, as was mentioned, is from the trade union movement. And women make up the majority of trade union members in Canada now because of how the union movement has evolved. And giving women strong representation to pursue their workplace interests more effectively is vital. Finally, retirement. Women have different experiences and needs during retirement, not least because they live longer than men, which means they need a pension that is going to last a bit longer on average than for men. And of course, it's a good thing to live longer, but that does open up all kinds of challenges about how you protect and support women through their retirement, especially given the gender pay gap which they experienced all through their working lives. So those are some of the workplace dimensions of the problem that are of particular interest to me, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And so welcome to all of you. I really appreciate you spending the Thursday before a long weekend with us and talking about this important topic. So Claudia, will you talk about, in your mind, what role does gender inequality play in the Canadian economy?
Absolutely. So I'm wearing my Chamber of Commerce hat, so I'll focus on the labor market impacts primarily, but I think it's important to note that I think there's economic impacts to every aspect of gender justice. There's a price tag associated with violence against women. There's a cost to mental health, and Jim and Eva mentioned some of these issues as well. So there's a cost to everything, but from an economic perspective. But if we just focus on the labor market, the issue that Jim mentioned as well was it's not productive from an economic perspective to have women and men or different genders allocated into particular sectors simply based on gender norms, not based on their interests or skills, but based on expectations. And this starts from a very young age. We know that girls and boys are socialized very early on into particular career paths. So you have, as a result, sectors in which women are vastly overrepresented and others in which they are vastly underrepresented. And there are several stats to illustrate this, but just to give you a few, in Ontario, women account for only 7% of workers in trades and transportation roles, 20% in technology, 24% in natural and applied sciences, and in leadership positions across Canada, 20% of all directors and officer positions. And there was a list published a few years ago of the 100 top paid executives in Canada, and there were more people named Brian and Paul than there were women on that list. So this is a problem, and these distortions have a lot of economic impacts. You can look at GDP. There have been a few studies that try to quantify the impacts to GDP. McKinsey and Company says within a decade, this is a 2017 report, within a decade, Canada could add $150 billion to its GDP by improving women's representation in the workforce. RBC put the number at 100 billion. It can be hard to estimate these things, but clearly there are quantifiable impacts. You can also look at the output in an economy. So the goods and services that are produced when you have less representation within corporations, it's unlikely that the goods and services that they're producing are representing the needs of all people because there's less diversity making those decisions. And you know, there's a number of other studies that look at different areas of impact, but I could go on. Clearly, the economic impacts are significant and multifaceted.
Thank you so much. Eva will ask you the same question. What role does gender equality play in the Canadian economy?
I have my mind's in a few places here because I'm thinking about some of the research that I've done with Indigenous communities in gender work and care. So looking at employment engagement opportunities and looking at care work, people who are double duty carers, you know, taking up work that is in care, but also having to provide care for themselves or for their families rather. So I'm thinking about how a lot of this care burden, I shouldn't say it like burden, because for a lot of folks, care is actually a very fulfilling duty to in their role for friends or adult relatives or relatives just in general. But much of the care responsibility is placed on feminized people. So when I think about gender inequality, it's most often the responsibility of care that's falling upon women, and it's not any different in Indigenous communities as well. There's not a lot of supports there for carers who are working toward, you know, who are in these roles of full-time employment and also doing care work. And this leads to a significant amount of burnout amongst worker carers, particularly Indigenous folks. Now we have the other added layer of institutionalization for Indigenous carers. So as you know, as we should all know by now, that Canadian institutions have taken this very paternalistic approach in settler colonial genocide of Indigenous peoples, where we were denied the ability to care for our children. And this led to long-lasting impacts for Indigenous communities, for Indigenous peoples at large. And for this reason, there's a tendency not to want to institutionalize elders. There's or put them into long-term care, or, sometimes that's not a choice. But there's a lot of really intense, feelings, as we heard from, in our qualitative work and doing this research amongst folks who are doing care work for their families or for their relatives. And now, so that's one aspect of it. So gender inequality playing in the Canadian economy, because we have a very large, aging population. And so that that responsibility is falling upon the shoulders of some of the most skilled workers. And so, the workforce or the workforce is the most skilled members of the workforce are increasingly needing to take up the responsibility of care work as well. And so again, this is all feminized labor, and it's unpaid labor, and it's labor that again is leading to a lot of exhaustion and burnout, particularly in COVID-19 as well, which we'll talk about, of course, a little later, I'm sure. And so I think it's really concerning, and it's a tension, and it's a juggling act that a lot of people, particularly feminized folks, are feeling and are balancing. I shouldn't even say balancing, they're juggling and they're struggling through it. The other thing I wanted to talk about is problematizing the Canadian economy. You know, the Canadian economy is based on the dispossession of Indigenous lands, waterways, and ways of life. And so it's, you know, for the Canadian economy to function, it needs a land base to extract resources from and for cheap. And so settler colonialism and all of the institutions that have impacted and led, you know, violently impacted Indigenous peoples were key to ensuring the dispossession of lands from Indigenous peoples to create the basis for a Canadian economy. So Indigenous lands, much of which Canada doesn't even have a sure title to, is used to extract from. That actually also has a component of gender inequality for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women specifically. So there's a particular gendered violence against women and Two-Spirit peoples that is felt as a result of, you know, extraction activities that take place on lands where, you know, we have man camps or a transient population that comes into a territory and poses a huge threat and risk to Indigenous women specifically, and Indigenous communities at large, I think, in those areas. So I'm thinking about, you know, how we might answer this question and speak to issues like the lack of affordable childcare or quality long-term care, or the gender pay gap, or rampant sexism or transphobia, and how all of this prevents people from engaging in the economies in ways that contribute to their quality of life. But how could a system based on dispossession and genocide of Indigenous peoples, with, again, that particular gendered violence against women and Two-Spirit peoples, be able to function equitably at all? I mean, that's a question that I'm really concerned with. I think it's quite paradoxical, and building a just and equitable society with an economy that works on top of this ongoing genocide and questionable title and a climate crisis, I think is just something that we really need to be talking about more broadly. And I think Canadians should really be concerning themselves with thinking about an economy that is not only, you know, not harmful and hostile to, you know, care and the caring of our relations, but also not hostile to the earth. Because I hate to be a doomer here, but, you know, unless we make some pretty big changes, we're headed in a pretty pretty worrisome. We are already heading in a worrisome direction.
Yeah, it's terrifying, you know, when you look at it, and you just see, it seems to be like we put our blinders on and just keep walking through. Jim, in your mind, what role does gender inequality play in Canadian economy?
Well, I was very lucky on this question, Danny, because our Center for Future Work, where I work as an economist, actually just published a fact book on gender inequality in the economy. And it was organized according to the different dimensions of gender inequality that we kind of categorized. And it wasn't quite an A to Z list. It only got to R. It was an A to R list of the different dimensions of gender inequality in the economy, because it comes at women from all over, again, at all stages of their life and in all kind of different ways that it affects them. So I won't go through all of those, A to R. I'll list some of them. Labor force participation, from my perspective as a labor economist, still very important, and women's labor force participation significantly below that of men. And we know the reasons why. It's because of inadequate access to childcare, inadequate support for workers, for women workers to juggle, as Eva just said, not balance, juggle the competing demands of your job and your home responsibilities and caring. So that's a big piece of it. And by the way, we have everyone and their dog complaining these days about a labor shortage in Canada and that we're running out of workers. Well, I know how to solve it. support women so they can both join the labor force and work more fully. Women are much more kind of channeled into part-time work rather than full-time work, and you'll solve the labor shortage right there. Secondly, there's the issue of what type of job you get. So women's employment has grown over time as labor force participation has grown. It's still not where it should be, but women are more likely to be in various forms of insecure or precarious employment, including part-time work, temporary jobs, various types of sort of independent contracting, some of which is phony, where they really should be just paid a wage, but instead the business outsources the job to a pseudo business. And now, of course, we've got gigs and digital platform work. Women are much more exposed to insecure work, even when they do get a job. Also, as we spoke about earlier, women are kind of channeled into certain occupations and certain skill sets that tend to be paid less on average than for men. The gender pay gap is a really important piece of it. Women make less per hour than men, about 11% less, according to the latest data. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because it's not just what you get paid per hour, it's also what kind of a job you have, how much you work, and how your career is interrupted over time. So if you look at it at average annual earnings rather than average hourly earnings, the pay gap is much worse, over 30%. And if you look at it as average working age lifetime earnings, then it's even worse, because women tend to have more career interruptions, and that affects the whole trajectory of their subsequent work. Care, Eva mentioned care and gender and work, and that is a huge piece of it, both the caring work that women do at home, but also the caring work that women do in their jobs. So women do disproportionately fill more of the care jobs, or more of the jobs in the so-called care economy that we have in Canada, including things like healthcare, education, aged care, disability services, early childhood education, and so on. And the double burden of care and work, in a way, spills over into women's professional experiences as well. And the absence of accessible quality childcare is a big piece of that. We've done some research on the childcare piece that, Danny, maybe we can get into in more detail later. Exposure to violence and harassment of various kinds obviously has a gender dimension, and there's economic costs to that, not just for the victims of that violence, but for the way the whole economy functions. Ownership of wealth, because women obviously make less money over their lives. That means they accumulate less savings, but they're also less able to tap into some of the other pools of wealth that are accumulated in the economy. And that affects retirement as well, of course, through personal savings, RRSPs, occupational pension plans, all of which are inferior for women. And behind it all, in a way, there's a deeper issue that, again, I think Eva was getting at, around power, gender and power, and the overlap between who gets to call the shots, whether it's in our business world, or whether it's in our electoral and political institutions, or whether it's just in society. And women are fighting for power, but they don't have their share of it yet remotely. And that, in a way, shapes all the other dimensions of inequality. There's still a few letters in the list I didn't get to, but that was some of them, Danny.
Thank you so much. It's mind-boggling when you think about it, in a list like that of how much there really is to this conversation. Eva, we'll go to you on, do you have any personal experiences around this discussion?
Around gender inequality and the economy. I think, I didn't really know how to answer this question, Danny. I was kind of like, but how does, well, I think, I'm a mom. I have a child. I have an 11-year-old, and he'll be 12 in the summer. And I think about the supports that I've needed and that I've required. My child's also transgender, so I think about that as an intersection of the experience of supports that we have as families who are raising, genderqueer youth, and essentially how that impacts a lot of our experiences. So I'm thinking about you know, I it's I'm having a hard time answering this question. I think, can you, like, I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think you did answer it. I think, you know, having to juggle being a mom and you know, everything else you do just talks about what those personal experiences folks are having. So
Yeah, and I think there's an immense mental load, I think, for a lot of folks, particularly in the absence of supports, and again in a pandemic where we are all kind of coming into and having to stay within our kind of nuclear families, right? And so that definitely makes things very difficult. The move to online learning and so on was particularly difficult, I think, for a lot of parents, a lot of people who provide care, and juggling again all of the realities of life while trying to keep up with an economy without a lot of supports, financial or otherwise. I think it's really important to note.
100%. And I'm going to share a personal story because I can. But I'm a welder by trade. I have all 6 of my welding tickets, and it was a few years ago, maybe 20 years ago when I went. But there was no toilet seat in the bathroom at the trade school I went to. And so I would have to go across the street if I had to go to the bathroom. And then I would come back and make them, like, sort of repeat everything I missed. But I thought, you know, I have so much privilege as, you know, I was a young white woman. My dad was in the trades. I come out of the trade movement. So I sort of already had sort of a, you know, the ability to stand up for myself. But I think now, as we encourage, I work in a building construction trade union, and I work to get women into the trades. And I think, what are we sending them into? You know, we keep saying women in tech and women in trade, but it's not just about how they have the ability. It's about what they face when they get into the workforce. That is so, you can't just write, you just can't write a manual to write that piece out. So, you know, I appreciate it. Yeah. Claudia.
Thank you, Danny. I have been very privileged in my life and my career so far, but I did have an opportunity to speak to many women and employers and HR professionals as well in doing some research for a report that the OCC published in 2020 called the Covery Project. And a lot of what you were saying just now around the skilled trades especially is what I heard as well from the workers' perspective. A lot of women I spoke to entered the skilled trades and they were passionate about it, and they dropped out for various reasons, either because they couldn't find childcare that would meet the schedule of shift work, or because there was outward discrimination towards them. One woman said she was very qualified, overqualified in fact, but she was told to hold the stop sign because the other men on the job said they didn't think she could handle more than that. The washroom situation, the uniforms were one size fits all, just a ton of stories that made them leave. And so there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because if you don't have an inclusive culture, you're not going to attract women. And if you don't have diversity, you don't create an inclusive culture. So that is something I heard consistently. Also from the business perspective, I think there's a clear shift happening towards recognizing this as an important issue for them, and recognizing the business case for diversity and inclusion. It's not just something that is nice to have, but it helps attract workers. And Jim mentioned the labor shortage. It is something that they're looking at to be competitive, and that helps. Leaders are talking about it as a priority. You're seeing organizations set targets and make commitments. That said, there is still a big shift that needs to happen in terms of actual action and accountability, because a lot of it is still kind of virtue signaling. And I find it interesting, every year on International Women's Day, you'll see a lot of organizations post very nice things on social media. And a lot of them are being backed now by targets that they're setting or commitments that they're making, but there still is a gap between what's being said and what's being done. And the pandemic also, I think, played a role in improving things to some extent, because it's changed the way that people think about work. You could literally see into people's homes through the Zoom screen, and that did force some employers to start thinking about how they can support their employees so that they could keep them employed. So there has been some positive offshoots from that, but still a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, thank you. And I will share, back to my welding life, there is a welding shop here in London, Ontario that has yet to hire a female welder, because in the shop there is no bathroom and you would have to go all the way to the front office to use the bathroom. This is a unionized shop, Jim, from my home union, and we still have been unsuccessful to get a woman hired there. Lots apply, but still, 2022, because they use the bathroom as a cost inability, but we still have been unsuccessful. Someday we'll break that barrier, but still today. Jim?
That is an astounding story, Danny. I'm flabbergasted and so sorry to hear that. The cost of a bathroom is peanuts, trivial compared to the cost of not being able to recruit the welders that you need to run a business. So this isn't I can't even blame greed for this decision. That's just management stupidity. So
and we can all pee in the same toilet. We really can.
please encourage your old union local to just shut that place down until they do that basic thing. That's ridiculous. Anyway, I got off on a tangent, a tirade and a tangent there. Wow. Well, on this question, Danny, I mean, obviously, I'm the beneficiary of a privileged situation in a very unequal world. So I was supported and privileged from a very early age as a boy, being told what I could do and what I was capable of. And there's no doubt that among all of the other dimensions in the booklet, contributed to my life, and I regret and am shamed that was at the expense of people without the same privilege. And I'm determined to use my abilities as an economist and the platforms that I have to try and build a more equal economy. I will say I work in one of the most male-dominated professions going, and that's economics, which is curious. It shouldn't be. And it reflects all kinds of things, including the poor way that economics is often taught at universities. And I would say some of the culture, sexist culture in the practice of economics. So I also am committed to working within economics to try and support women economists, feminist economists, and create more equality along all dimensions as well, including race and indigeneity in the profession. So I helped to start a group in Canada called the Progressive Economics Forum, PEF. And one of our missions explicitly was to try to encourage more young women in universities to go into economics and stick with it, despite some of the hurdles that they face. So I'm the beneficiary of privilege that I didn't deserve and that I'm working to get rid of. So thank you.
Thank you. Our last question is, Canadian economist researchers are calling the Covery after COVID-19 disproportionately affected women. What needs to happen for a recovery to occur? It was hard for me to say. Jim, we'll go right back to you as our resident.
Okay. This is a great question. We're going to open up so many doors with this one. The impact of the COVID pandemic and the resulting recession was felt disproportionately by women workers. And so people, including my friend Armin Yelnizyan, termed the coin she-cession rather than recession to indicate the fact that women, first of all, were more likely to lose their jobs, in part because of the sectors that they worked in. So things like retail and hospitality and all those other consumer-facing sectors suffered the impacts of the lockdowns first and worst. So more women than men lost their jobs initially. Also, the fact that I'd mentioned earlier, women are more likely to be in casual or temporary or part-time roles where employers can get rid of you quicker without costs. So that was another contributing factor. Then you had the fact that it was chaos, wasn't it? It still is chaos, trying to juggle home responsibilities, supporting kids when daycare and schools were closed, and do your job from home sometimes, or most people still had to go to work to do their jobs. And that unsustainable situation for trying to work and care for your family also was felt disproportionately by women. So women's labor force participation fell more than men's during the recession. So for all those reasons, the impact was felt disproportionately by women. That means we need the she-covery instead of a recovery to make sure that the recovery is privileging women and supporting women's continued re-engagement with the labor market after. And good news deserves to be recognized. That is happening. So women's labor force participation has recovered to where it was before the pandemic and then some. That's a very positive sign. More women are working today than before the pandemic. That's also a very positive sign. We are seeing some movement on the policy factors that are required to support women's continued employment. I am very excited about the National Child Care Program, and I've done work on the economic benefits of that program for women, but also for the labor market and the overall economy. There's all kinds of ways that a national universal $10 a day childcare program will support the economy. Number one, it creates tons of jobs in those childcare centers, which is helpful as you're recovering from a pandemic, as well as indirect jobs in the different industries that supply those childcare centers with construction, with utilities, with equipment, with training, et cetera, et cetera. The biggest benefit, of course, based on the experience we have in Canada between provinces, Quebec has something close to a universal childcare program, and they have, not coincidentally, the highest female labor force participation in Canada. They also have a higher incidence of full-time work for women, so that it's not just that you can get back to work, you can also work full-time. Women who are often limited to only part-time roles often lose out on the promotion opportunities and so on that allow you to advance your career. It's very hard to advance your career from a part-time position. So those benefits are huge. We estimated 725,000 full-time equivalent increased female labor supply at a moment, as we talked about, when we have a labor shortage. So the enhanced GDP from early childhood education, like that, enormous. We said between 60 and $100 billion a year after it was fully phased in. And here's the kicker. Government collects a share, as you noticed. We just had tax day a few weeks ago. Government collects a share of every dollar of GDP. And so without changing taxes or anything, governments, federally and provincially, would receive between 17 and $29 billion a year in extra revenue, thanks to all the extra economic activity that the child care program allowed, which is more than enough to pay for the child care program. That's the best thing. It's that this is one program that literally does pay for itself. So if we really want to see Covery, then accelerating and resourcing and making sure we do this right. It's in motion now. All the provinces have signed on. That's excellent. Ontario was the last, and there was no excuse for that. But now they're on. Let's move it forward and make sure it's got the resources for the quality service delivery that we need, and that will make a heck of a contribution to the She Covery, I really believe.
Amazing. That's awesome. Claudia?
Yes, 100% to everything Jim said. The childcare deal is massive, not just in size, but in the way that it's tackling supply and not just demand, as has been done in the past in Canada with subsidies for parents that hasn't addressed the issues. So very excited about that. I think, looking at what's needed for a She Covery, one of the main challenges with going beyond rhetoric is that there's no single group that's entirely responsible for gender inequities. I think everyone has a role: businesses, unions, post-secondary institutions, parents, individuals, governments, but none of them can solve the problem alone. So it makes it more challenging because you do need a lot of collaboration, and the accountability is kind of spread across different groups. So we need a strategy that everyone is kind of working together on, and ideally we have targets that are shared, that everyone is supporting. It all really starts with the leadership and accountability. A lot of conversations are happening right now around economic recovery within businesses, within government, and women are not at the table often as part of those conversations. So the federal and provincial governments had set up task forces for women's recovery to address this, to make sure that there was diversity in how those decisions were being made. But frankly, I'm not sure if they've led to anything concrete yet. So number one thing is to make sure that there's diversity in leadership and at the decision-making table, which I don't think we're there yet. More specifically, I think there's a lot that can be done, and we do have the solutions at hand for workforce development. There are a lot of really good programs out there that are helping encourage younger girls and women to enter into certain fields, that are working with employers to help them address the gender pay gap. There are a lot of good programs there that could be scaled, but I think it does come down to the leadership and the incentives to actually do those things and invest in them. And women's entrepreneurship is also something that I don't think we've discussed so far, but the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on businesses that were owned by women over businesses owned by men. And there's a few reasons for that. There are cultural barriers. Those businesses tend to be smaller and newer, but there are also biases that prevent women-owned businesses from accessing financing to the same extent that male-owned businesses are. And so only 4% of venture capital funding in Canada goes towards women-owned businesses, but they represent 28% of all businesses. So they were in a worse position when the pandemic hit, and they were more likely to close their doors or lose customers as a result of the pandemic. So that's bad for the economy as a whole, because you want more innovation, you want more small business growth, and we're just limiting diversity within that segment of the economy. So a lot more can be done to create a more inclusive ecosystem for entrepreneurs, make sure that they have access to capital, access to mentorship and resources, legal support. I think that the solutions are there. I think that the challenge is the incentives and the accountability.
Yeah. That it's just, I find my brain is thinking of all the things you say. The Gender Equality Coalition, we just were lucky enough to get a skills development grant in partnership with Bancha around women in tech. And the Gender Equality Coalition sort of spin on it is we really wanted to talk to sort of diverse women, ask women from different places that normally get asked. So we're going to take the opportunity outside of sort of the normal mainstream to talk a lot about mental health, anxiety, mental health, stress, and how even though that might be part of your life, you can still do all of these programs. So we've built into this Women in Tech program not only the opportunity for women and diverse women to apply, but so that mental health and anxiety and some of these pieces aren't also a barrier. So I'm excited to see how that works out. Eva.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm learning so much. It's so interesting to hear everything Claudia and Jim are speaking about in terms of how women have felt the pandemic disproportionately than men, essentially. Yeah, again, my mind goes a lot of different ways. So I think, societies that provide solid, supportive foundations for children and their caregivers have better health outcomes, and everyone fares better when governments invest in children. And again, care is feminized. I do a lot of work with care, so that's kind of where my mind goes to when I'm thinking about economy. And meaning that women and femmes, of course, more often take up that work of informal care, and they're not paid for it. And so when I think about She Covery, there's a few things. Actually, one thing that came to my mind is in our worldviews, in Anishinaabe and Okwamwe worldviews, our environment and our earth is a female energy, right? So I think about I'm thinking about it beyond human embodiments as well. So thinking about, are we in a status quo where we want to just make things a little bit better before something else kind of happens, right? So I think I'm kind of the mind that a rehaul altogether needs to happen. So we're looking at this economy, a capitalist economy that is essentially based on extraction and all of these types of activities that aren't that aren't really good for us or really any of the beings here on Earth. So I'm thinking about how not only does this system kind of alienate us from each other, it alienates us from our world, from our environment, right? And so I'm thinking about those connections and those connections that really matter and will matter for our future collectively, not just like, as Canadians or as Indigenous peoples, or just as humans, right? So I think about economy, Indigenous economies specifically, where they do exist, and when they do exist, they're generally marginalized. They're generally considered alternative economies, or are oftentimes, at odds or facing hostility from settler economies. So I think about the Mi'kmaq fisheries. I also think about, the higher rates of economic uncertainty because of systemic issues like chronic underfunding of education systems and just of Indigenous education systems, specifically for on-reserve First Nations versus off-reserve First Nations folks, and the discrepancies between the discrepancies between the funding of them. And this chronic underfunding of education systems can lead to not only that, but also the child welfare system leads to a disproportionate number of Indigenous peoples who are incarcerated. So much so that just last year in 2019, or sorry, 3 years ago, oh my gosh, 2019, I feel like we're losing years here. So much so that a correctional investigator of Canada said that the prison system is actually increasingly indigenized. So he used indigenized in the context of meaning that there's more and more Indigenous peoples going into these systems. So I think about my investment personally as an Anishinaabe person, as an Indigenous person, thinking about, yes, our participation in the economy, but for the vast majority, for I should say a good chunk of Indigenous folks are struggling to even participate in this economy. And that's not even, speaking in terms of gender terms, we're speaking about just the overwhelming issues that a lot of our folks are dealing with as a result of systemic injustices, right? And a society and an economy, honestly, the Canadian economy that causes the immiseration of Indigenous peoples. So I just wanted to put a plug in here for the Yellowhead Institute authored a report called Cashback, which was about the impact of the Canadian economy on Indigenous communities, Indigenous nations, and how the Canadian economy dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their economies, and what Indigenous folks are doing, and communities, peoples, nations, so on, are doing to really rebuild our economies in a way that is mindful of all those connections that I spoke about, those connections that is a sustainable economy, one that isn't harmful, one that isn't necessarily based in a profit model, but more so maybe a reciprocal model or a sustainability model. So again, I can provide the link to that. It's you can go to the Yellowhead Institute and look at Cashback. Yeah, that's what it is, the Cashback report. Yeah, thanks for putting that in the chat. So that was co-authored by my colleagues, Naomi Metallic and Sherry Pasternak, and has an amazing amount of toolkits and resources and really accessible ways to look at how how we're living in very different worlds as Indigenous peoples when it comes to economy. And that's, again, not just, that's not even bringing gender into it, because again, the most vulnerable parts of our population are those who are gendered or, gender queer, gender fluid, two-spirit folks. And I think about them as well when we're talking about a Covery. How are we making space for gender beyond, a binary, and what kinds of areas are these folks working in? Maybe that's even a question that I might ask panelists, is how do we think about, when we talk about gender in the economy, we're talking a lot about women, but what does it look like for, trans folks or gender fluid folks, and where are their the concerns and the issues, and how are we ensuring that they're also included in the discussion as well? So that's something I'm thinking about as well.
That's a great question. And I think it's something we have to not only talk about, but intentionally talk about, right? Like we can't just say, men, women, and non-gendered folks. We have to really start having this conversation, what that means. Years ago, I was doing women in housing and homeless conference, and an Indigenous grandfather said to me that the homelessness and the sort of poverty piece was manufactured along with the colonization, and that there you can point into history in Canada when it happened, and before settlers came, before we came, it didn't exist. And I think a lot of that in all the work I did, because if it didn't exist, in such a short period of time ago, we could get back there. And what does that mean?